Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a land where the scent of pine and the quiet swish of silk robes are only interrupted by the sharp whisper of steel. You're waking up in feudal Japan. Somewhere around the 16th century, there's a thin mist hugging the ground outside your paper screen walls. The sun's first golden finger is nudging the corner of your sleeping mat, and a servant has just slid open the shoshi door to announce the hour. You stretch, sit up straight, and do the thing every samurai worth his salt does before breakfast. You write a poem about dying. Yup. Before the rice, before the tea, before you've even scratched your nose or yawned properly, you're summoning your finest metaphors to imagine how your death might look, feel, sound, and how it should be remembered. And no, this isn't optional. It's not a quirky tradition for poetry nerds in armor. This is expected, even admired, because in this world, death isn't an interruption, it's the centerpiece. And if you're not ready to face it before your stomach's even full, you probably won't survive this century. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you under a cozy blanket in California or brushing your teeth in Tokyo? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel on the tatami mat, your brush is ready, the inkstone freshly ground. Outside, a crow caws in that eerie, too-human voice crows seem to favor. You think for a moment, what will your poem be today? Something about autumn leaves? A metaphor with a fleeting cherry blossom? Or maybe something a bit darker, like a rusted sword under moonlight? You weren't forced to do this, but somewhere along the line between the rigid codes of Bushido and the influence of Zen, come to believe it matters. A proper warrior doesn't just die well, he prepares to die beautifully. Historians still argue whether this was truly a widespread mourning ritual or something reserved for more elite samurai, but the cultural ideal persisted. Be ready to go, body and soul, at any moment. This idea wasn't just whispered in poetry corners, it was drilled into you by your master. It appeared in military handbooks, and it echoed in the stories you heard as a child tailors, where a single brushstroke before battle was as mighty as the blow that followed. One mainstream historical fact: the death poem was real and recorded, especially during the Edo period. Daimyo lords, swordmasters, and even Buddhist monks left behind final verses with startling calmness, as if death were merely a change of scenery. And these weren't long-winded odes either. Most were incredibly short, sometimes a single line, always reflective, often seasonal. Because nothing says I accept death quite like comparing your fate to a falling persimmon. Picture this. You're about to lead a patrol into uncertain territory. Your men are tense. You've just received intel that the rival clan may strike before dusk, so you sit down and calmly compose. The blade is quiet, but so is the snow tonight. I walk both paths now. Then you roll it up, tuck it into your sleeve, and proceed to instruct your men on how to tie their armor straps correctly. Why? Because writing it centers you. It reminds you of the point. That being a warrior, isn't just about skillets, about grace in the face of nothingness. Still with me? Now imagine the awkward silence. If someone asked, "Hey, you didn't write your poem this morning?" That's like showing up to a board meeting in pajamas, except it's about mortality, not spreadsheets. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some samurai were known to write their death poem the night before a battle ends, then rewrite it in the morning if they felt it didn't land quite right. That's right. They edited their farewell to existence. Needs more metaphor. doesn't capture the dying swan thing enough. Artistic perfectionism or quiet terror? Maybe both. One recorded example comes from the 14th century. The warrior Kusunoki composed, "I'll be born again 7 times to grasp the sword in service of my country." That's not just a goodbye. That's a battle cry, disguised as reincarnation, fan fiction. And here's something you might not expect. This poetic discipline wasn't always solemn. Sometimes it was oddly playful. One anonymous warrior, about to commit ritual suicide, penned, "For 30 years, I've been killing time gets its revenge today." Bit of gallows humor, somewhere between Zen calm and dark stand-up comedy. What's more, this daily poetic habit blurred the lines between life and death. You started to treat both with equal detachment. Cherry blossoms bloom, cherry blossoms fall. You breathe, you don't. Neither matters more than how you carry each moment. Now zoom out. The dawn has passed. Your ink has dried. Outside, the courtyard begins to stir soft steps of younger students. The thud of wooden swords colliding in warm-up drills. You rise, slide your poem into your sleeve, and walk toward the dojo, ready to spar with ghosts and live another day. Maybe, but just in case you've already said what needed saying. You step into the courtyard, where pale morning light spills like water across the polished flagstones. A training sword rests in your hand, but your mind is still echoing with that poem you wrote. You barely notice the cold air against your wrists. Instead, you're still dancing with the quiet thought that this might be the last sunrise you'll ever see. That's not paranoia, that's practice. Because here in the world of the samurai, you don't just learn how to fight, you learn how to die. Not eventually, not someday, but now. This hour, before the soup's even cooled. The cult of prepared death, as some modern scholars call it, wasn't built overnight. It was stitched together from Zen teachings, battlefield pragmatism, and a deeply rooted Japanese respect for You weren't just taught to face death, you were expected to welcome it as a familiar companion. Now here's the mainstream historical fact. The samurai code Bushido wasn't fully codified until the Tokugawa period, but its core values, honor, loyalty, readiness to die, were shaped long before that by a blend of Confucian, Buddhist, and Shinto ideas. And death wasn't a shadow you avoided, it was the mirror you stared into every day. You wouldn't call it morbid, more like ... necessary. Like sharpening your sword, or brushing your teeth. Daily contact with mortality kept your ego from swelling, and your purpose razor clear. And yes, that included poetry, because if you can compose something serene and beautiful in the face of oblivion, you probably won't flinch when the real moment comes. It's the ultimate stress test. Write a farewell that would make a monk nod and your enemies weep. And do it before breakfast. Historians still argue whether this obsession with readiness was universal among all samurai, or more of an elite affair, something that high-ranking warriors practiced while foot soldiers just, panicked. But what's clear is that the ideal filtered down. Even low-born warriors carried the echo of that expectation. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit for you. Some samurai would deliberately carry their jizei folded inside their clothing when going into battle, like a spiritual business card. If they fell, their enemies or comrades could find it and know their final thought. It was like pinning a very dramatic sticky note to your chest. P.S. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. Now imagine the mindset that takes. You strap on your armor, tuck your poem in next to your heart, and walk calmly into mayhem. You've already said your piece. Everything else is just choreography. And this preparedness didn't just serve psychological comfort, it shaped your decisions. Say you're leading a unit against a rival clan. You're outnumbered. The options are ugly, but you remember, you're already prepared to die. So you act not from panic, but clarity. That's the paradox. By facing death constantly, you become a more effective instrument of life. There's a deep silence in that realization, a stillness, even in the dojo now, as wooden swords clash and students grunt. There's a kind of peace. The peace of people who've made their peace. That doesn't mean they all wanted to die. Far from it. You were still allowed to fear, to hesitate, to love the feeling of being alive. But you didn't cling. You floated. Remember that crow from earlier? Still circling, still watching. In Japanese folklore, crows are both omens and messengers. They remind you that the veil between life and death isn't a door, it's a rice paper wall. A samurai once said, "Live as though already dead." It wasn't defeatist, it was liberating. You train harder when you know your body could stop working any moment. You listen more closely. You speak more carefully. You don't waste time pretending to be immortal. So, yes, the death poem before breakfast isn't just dramatic flair. It's practical, like a philosophical warm-up stretch. Let's zoom in again. You've just finished morning drills. Your wrist stings slightly from a parried strike. You kneel by the stone basin to rinse your face. The water is icy. You look up and catch your reflection brief, rippling, and again you remember. This could be it. This could be the last time water touches your skin. And that's the real art of this culture, not just writing good poems, but living in such a way that the moment of death doesn't catch you off guard. You've been rehearsing. Your lines are memorized. The stage is set. Here's a famous example. A general named Tori Matada knew he was about to be overwhelmed during the siege of Fushimi in 1600. Instead of fleeing, he stayed behind with his men and wrote one of the most admired letters in samurai history, full of serenity, loyalty, and his own poetic vision of death. He wrote, "Even if we die for no greater reason, we still die in glory. When our death has style." Okay, that last line may not be a direct translation, but the spirit is there. Die well. Die with ink on your fingers, not just blood. And if you get to live another day, well, rewrite your poem tomorrow. No pressure. The ink is dry now, tucked neatly into the folds of your inner robe, close to your skin. You've eaten, you've trained, and the rest of the day unfolds before you like a scroll. But that poem you wrote this morning, it lingers, and you start to wonder, what makes a death poem good? Not all verses are created equal. This isn't just random emotional venting. Samurai death poems followed real patterns, sometimes rigid ones. Like everything else in your world, there was structure, expectation, and a whisper of sacredness. Now, let's talk form. The most common type of GZ was written in one of two formats, which is 5 lines in a 5-7-5-7-7 syllable pattern, or haiku, which you probably already know, 3 lines in a 5-7-5 rhythm. And no, you weren't allowed to just scrawl anything and call it profound. There was a craft to it, a vibe, if you will. Poems leaned toward natural imagery like the moon setting, a withering leaf, or the first snowfall. The metaphors always had that classic Japanese mood of transience, a concept known as mano no aware, basically the ache of beautiful things fading. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Zen Buddhist monks, who heavily influenced samurai culture, often wrote death poems. Themselves, some of the most famous examples in Japanese history come from monks, not warriors. Their verses emphasized detachment, silence, and the dissolution of the self, like this classic from Kozani Shikyo, a 14th century monk. Empty-handed I entered the world. Barefoot I leave it. My coming, my going, two simple happenings that got entangled. Simple, clean, no panic, just a sigh in ink. But samurai, they sometimes added a little extra zing. Take this one by Maria Sanan. Bury me when I die beneath a wine barrel in a tavern. With luck the cask will leak. A man of taste, clearly, not just accepting death, toasting it. Here's your quirky fringe tidbit for this section. Some samurai would commission calligraphers to transcribe their death poems with elegant brushwork and gold ink sometimes before they died. Yes, pre-ordered poetic tombstones, which, if nothing else, tells you two things. They expected to go out dramatically, and they really cared about fonts. That brings us to the odd question of timing. Death poems weren't only scribbled in the final moment. In fact, they could be written years before death, updated occasionally like a will, or, in some cases, rewritten obsessively every week. This isn't just hypothetical. The Edo period samurai Hosokawa Grato, one of the rare Christian converts in samurai society, reportedly had multiple versions of her death poem, adjusting them as her spiritual beliefs deepened. Historians still argue whether these living death poems were meant as flexible pre-planning tools, or whether they were just early drafts that didn't quite hit the emotional target. Either way, you can imagine the emotional weirdness of sitting down after lunch and going, that last one about the falling bamboo? Too gloomy? Let's punch it up with a firefly. You might be wondering what happens if your poem is bad. Like really bad? Don't worry, we'll get to those in a later section. But let's just say, even samurai weren't immune to the fear of leaving behind cringe. Back to the style. A good death poem wasn't just about technique. It needed tone. Not too proud, not too sad, not too desperate. Detachment was the gold standard. Imagine you're narrating your own vanishing while sipping green tea. That's the aesthetic. Picture this. You've been summoned to duel at dusk. Your rival is waiting on the bridge by the temple gates. You kneel beneath a maple tree, brush poised and composed. Wind in the pine leaves has whispered my name all day. It will be quiet when I do not answer. If the sky will just turn away. Not bad. Elegant, sad, and just the right amount of dramatic. But sometimes the truly powerful poems came not from perfect warriors but from flawed human ones. Old soldiers, exiled lords, disgraced vassals. Because for them, the poem wasn't just a performance. It was a confession. Take the case of the poet Samurai Titi, a 15th century military tactician and castle builder who was ultimately betrayed and killed by his own clan. He reportedly penned, "Had I known I would die this way, I would have built my house beneath the spring blossoms." That's poetic regret, layered over political murder. And yet, there's a strange piece to it too. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Writing a death poem didn't just help the person dying. It also guided the people left behind. For families, comrades, even enemies, these verses became moral compasses, a kind of portable legacy. If your words were strong, serene, and memorably, your death meant something. One soldier might whisper another's poem on the eve of battle. A son might carry his father's verse into adulthood. Or an old rival, long past the war, might pause at a shrine and murmur the last lines of a man he once tried to kill. That's the power of a few good syllables. They outlive your armor, outlive your bones. Sometimes they outlive entire dynasties. So, tomorrow morning, when the sun peeks through that rice paper screen again, and you dip your brush into the inkstone with sleepy fingers, you'll know the weight of the lines. You're right. They're not just goodbye notes. They're proof that you understood the assignment. And if it turns out you get to live another day, well, maybe you'll rewrite that last line. It was a bit heavy on the moon metaphors. The breakfast tray arrives, steaming gently in the cool air. A modest spread, pickled daikon, grilled fish, a bowl of white rice, and miso soup. You sit, Caesar style, spine straight, legs folded neatly beneath you. Outside, bamboo rustles, and a temple bell tolls, the hour with slow, sonorous gravity. This right here is where things get weirdly philosophical, because in the samurai world, breakfast isn't just a meal. It's a ritual act of presence. You eat, but you eat with awareness, aware that this may be your final bowl of rice. Every grain could be your last. Every swallow, a quiet farewell. No one talks much at the table. It's not impolite, it's disciplined. The focus stays inward. Your poem has been written, your body trained. Now, even the act of eating folds into this ongoing meditation on mortality. And yes, it's dramatic. But so is everything when you've accepted that death could arrive between spoonfuls. This exact kind of quiet, reflective breakfast is echoed in stories and manuals from the Tokugawa era, a period marked by peace, but not relaxation, because peace, for the samurai, didn't mean retirement. It meant preparing even more intensely, since battle could come without warning and, worse, without honor. Mainstream historical fact. During the Edo period, samurai still followed martial routines, including poetry and meditation. Even when actual combat was rare, their loyalty was expected to be both military and moral, which makes sense when you consider the state-sponsored blend of Zen and Bushido being taught. This system didn't train warriors to be fearless. It trained them to be ready to greet death like a returning guest, not an unwanted intruder. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit for this section. In some temples, monks and samurai alike would eat from black lacquered balso. The reflection of their face reminded them of their impermanence as they lifted each bite. Yep, you literally see yourself fade as you slurp That's next-level existential seasoning. But this breakfast, this quiet contemplation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's stitched into your worldview. You are taught to perceive time differently, to feel the edge of each moment, and to honor what others would overlook. That thin slice of pickled plum, it's not just salty. It's a reminder that the harshest flavors often hold the most clarity. That warm rice, each grain once clung to a field, survived storms, was harvested, milled, and steamed just like you, shaped by forces beyond control. And that cup of green tea, sipped slowly, held with two hands, eyes lowered. It's the perfect metaphor. Hot, for only a moment, then gone. This isn't some Pinterest version of mindfulness. It's raw, serious, and often pretty lonely. Because here's the paradox. The more you dwell in death, the more vividly you start to feel life. Historians still argue whether this hyper-awareness came more from Zen influence or the isolation of samurai life itself, cut off from peasantry, locked into rigid roles, unable to pursue passions outside the warrior identity. Either way, your morning poem and your silent breakfast share a pulse. They hum with the same electricity. Don't blink. This could be it. Now, here's something fascinating. There are documented cases of samurai choosing not to eat before battle. Not from anxiety, but from reverence. Imagine this. You're stationed at a mountain pass. Your scouts say the enemy is hours away. Your servant brings you food, but you wave it away. You don't want to dull your edge with fullness. Instead, you write a death poem and sip plain water. You want your last moment to be clean sharp as your blade. Later, that same servant finds your bowl untouched. Your poem, however, is folded precisely and sealed with wax. Its title, An empty stomach meets the horizon. Here's where modern logic might raise an eyebrow. You're not just dealing with trained killers here. You're dealing with trained thinkers, men who believe that every act, even Eden, had a role to play in their moral readiness. The chopsticks were as much a weapon as the sword. The teacup, a mirror. Let's not forget, you didn't always eat alone. Sometimes, before battle, a bento of final meals was shared among comrades. Some warriors tucked their poems beneath the lid, like fortune cookies with a much higher emotional payload. And in a few recorded cases, samurai who returned alive from a battle would gather again, read aloud the pose they'd written the night before. Laughter, tears, silence, all at the same table. It was a way to say, we lived through the thing we thought would kill us. Imagine that. A brotherhood forged in hypothetical death, bonded not just by victory but by vulnerability. Your poem, your plate, your presence, they all align. Even the small gestures matter. When you bow over your food, it isn't just habit. It's a nod to the moment, to the rice farmer, to the blade, to the silence waiting behind your shoulder. Breakfast ends. You wipe your hands on a folded cloth, tuck your sleeve, and rise. The scroll of the day unrolls once again. And though you don't know what the hours will bring, news of war, a call to duel, or perhaps just more practice, you've done the most important thing already. You acknowledged that this could be the end, and you were okay with it, at least poetically. You walk toward the armory, footsteps soft against the polished floorboards. Sunlight cuts through the paper doors in warm golden lines, casting long, sharp shadows. Your silhouette folds into the pattern like a brushstroke on a scroll. Your hand brushes against the hilt of your katana, polished, ready, familiar. But next to it, on the small wooden rack above your futon, lies your brush and ink. You glance between the two-blade and brush, and it strikes you, they are equal. In your world, they are both weapons, both tools of discipline, both sacred. A sword cuts through flesh, a poem cuts through fear. Today, the dojo is unusually quiet. Your instructor watches you approach with the usual unreadable stare, the kind that makes you stand straighter without realizing. You bow. He bows. No words exchanged. Just a brief hush of acknowledgement between two people who understand that every lesson could be their last. Because if there's one thing drilled into your bones, it's this. A sword is a pen is a grave. Every stroke of the blade must be intentional. Every movement, clean. Every word you leave behind, ink or action, becomes part of your legacy. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In feudal Japan, literacy among the samurai class was not just encouraged, it was expected. They were bureaucrats and governors as much as warriors. They wrote reports, poetry, letters, military strategy. They were walking contradictions. Men of battle and verse. This duality wasn't just poetic flair, it was survival. If you couldn't articulate your loyalty, your intention, or your resignation with grace, you risked dishonor or even punishment. A sloppy poem, a vague surrender, these things mattered as much as a missed sword swing. There's a famous phrase from the warrior poet Yamamoto Tsunetomo, author of the Hagakure, that goes something like, matters of great concern should be treated lightly. Matters of small concern should be treated seriously. And nowhere is that more obvious than in your balance of steel and ink. Historians still argue whether this idealized image of the poetic warrior was reality for the average samurai or more of a cultivated myths spread through literature and theater, especially during the long peace of the Edo era. But scrolls, death poems, letters, and battle journals do survive, and they tell us that this was more than just. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some samurai composed death poems during battle. Yes, while under siege, while bleeding, while hiding behind temple walls with arrows whizzing overhead, they would pause to write a few lines on a torn scrap of kimono, a rice wrapper, or the back of a wooden fan. One such example, the tale of Torie Sunaman in 1575, captured during the siege of Nagasino. He was crucified by the enemy for smuggling messages through enemy lines. Before he died, he shouted a final cry to his comrades. The castle still stands. Fight with honor. And allegedly, he tucked a poem into his sleeve. Not even this stake can hold me when Anna Call's wind lifts the banners. Now, back to the dojo. Today's lesson. I adore the art of drawing and striking with the sword in one smooth, beautiful motion. It's a bit like dancing with death, minus the music. You sit in seiza, your sword sheathed at your hip. One breath, then your hand moves, the blade flashes. A clean diagonal cut through the air. No enemy, no blood, just silence and control. You repeat it again and again, each movement deliberate, not rushed, because you're not practicing to survive, you're practicing to die well. And if your final strike is awkward, sloppy, or panicked, then what was it all for? You remember your instructor's words. Your last action will be your biography. No pressure. Outside, clouds begin to gather. You don't notice. Your entire focus is inward. Now, blade, breath, brush. The rhythm between violence and verse. You recall a poem you once copied from an old scroll. The blade must shine, but so must the soul. Rust is not just a failure, it is forget. You never forgot that line, even in dreams. Now, here's something not often mentioned in popular retellings. Samurai weren't always proud of the kill. Many of them carried deep spiritual scars from combat. So, the writing the death poem, the scroll, the prayer wasn't just tradition, it was release. A way to file away the unbearable into syllables. A way to cleanse the blade not of blood, but of memory. So, tonight, after you've trained and eaten and written, you sit in your chamber again. The candle flickers, the scroll is open, and with sore shoulders and calloused hands, you begin another poem. Not because you're planning to die, but because you respect the possibility. It reads, one clean line, one last cut ink on the blade's breath. Tonight I sleep without fear or armor. You roll it up, place it near your pillow, and extinguish the flame. Tomorrow you may write another, but for tonight the poem is enough. It begins with sweat. You're in the yard now, sleeves rolled, dust clinging to your hakuma. The sun is up higher than usual and the air is thick with cicada hum and discipline. You've been through drills since not just combat forms, but ceremonial footwork, etiquette, even how to bow without shaking, because every movement matters, especially when it might be your last. You aren't just training to kill, you're training to die beautifully. Strange concept, isn't it? But to the samurai, dying wasn't a glitch in the program. It was the natural, eventual punctuation mark on a sentence you'd spent your whole life writing. And how you reached that final moment, whether shaking and wailing or calm and dignified, told the world everything they needed to know about you. The ultimate test wasn't strength. It was grace under doom. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Training in traditional Japanese martial arts, particularly among the samurai, emphasized posture, breath control, and emotional regulation just as much as technique. Swordsmanship schools like Kashima Shintaraya or Yagib Shinkadraya didn't just teach how to strike, they taught how to fall. Literally and metaphorically, you were expected to memorize your own death choreography, the way you collapsed, the angle of your final bow, even the calm in your last blink. Every bit rehearsed until it became muscle memory, because no one wanted to die ugly. To thrash, cry, beg, to stain the legend you spent decades building. Historians still argue whether all samurai really did achieve this ideal in the chaos of battle, or if these accounts were polished after the fact, like editing a death scene for drama. There's no shortage of embellished tales, but the aspiration, that part was real. Let's zoom in. You're in the dojo again. But now your master is walking silently behind each student, tapping shoulders, adjusting stances. He watches how you kneel, how your hand rests on your sword, not tense, not limp, but prepared. Again, he says, die again. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. You draw your blade, step, turn, collapse, a motion practiced 100 times, because when death comes, you want to meet it like an old friend, not a stranger at the door. And here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some sword schools held theatrical death rehearsals, where advanced students were made to perform their ideal final moments in front of peers. Clothing, posture, even last words were judged, not for drama, but for harmony. The goal was authenticity, not showmanship. Imagine your classmate performing his death, falling in slow silence, eyes open, still focused. He whispers a final poem, and then the room breaks into soft, approving nods. Morbid, absolutely. But in this world, it's the peak of emotional mastery. You didn't fear dying. You feared dying badly. Take the tale of Minamoto no Tamatomo, a legendary archer from the 12th century. Surrounded, wounded, betrayed, he committed ritual suicide, not just with a sword, but by slicing open his own abdomen to reach his heart, just to prove he was still in control at the moment of death. Tamatomo's final act became the stuff of legend, a symbol of extreme courage and composure, and though his actual poem didn't survive, his method made a statement stronger than ink. This is where martial arts becomes spiritual. When your breath aligns with your motion, when your body carries your intention without needing words, when the death poem is already written into your movements. Today's drills are over. You bow. Your robe clings to your back with sweat. You return to your quarters and peel away the layers. The brush calls you again. But this time, it's different. You're not writing a full poem, just a line, a fragment. Today, my death wore sandals and walked past me in silence. Just that. You let it hang there. Maybe you'll finish it tomorrow. Maybe not. Because part of the practice is learning to let go. Mid-movement. There's a term for this in Zen. Mu. Emptiness. A kind of awareness that isn't filled with noise, but clarity. Samurai chased this sensation. Not with desperation, but with steady discipline. And strangely enough, the closer they got to it, the lighter they became. That's the paradox. Training to die beautifully doesn't weigh you down, it frees you. It gives you a kind of lightness, a peace that comes from knowing there's nothing more to fear. You'll start to see the difference between survival and presence. One clings, the other flows. So, tomorrow, when you practice your death fall again, when the blade flashes and your knees touch the mat, you won't be thinking about fame or glory. You'll be thinking about rhythm, about form, about stillness. And maybe, if the day is quiet enough, hear the silence answer back. The air is thick with incense now. You're in the inner chamber of a small fortress, wooden beams above, stone beneath, and the hush of something heavy hanging in the silence. There's a ceremonial blade on the floor before you. Its steel dull in the lamplight. Two men kneel across from you on your second, the other the quiet monk who will soon recite a prayer. You've written your poem. Now, you prepare to die by your own hand. This is seppuku, ritual suicide, performed by samurai to preserve honor, to avoid capture, or to atone for failure. It is not done lightly. It is not done without poetry, and more often than not, it begins with a few final, trembling lines, Georgisei, placed carefully beside the blade. Sometimes read aloud just before your body folds forward into eternity. Mainstream historical fact. Seppuku was most commonly carried out during the late medieval to early modern period of Japan, particularly between the 12th and 19th centuries. It followed a structured ritual. Purification, the writing of a death poem, the opening of the belly with a short blade, and, to end suffering quickly, beheading by a trusted second known as the Kaisakunin. You probably already know the basics of this grim performance, but what often gets lost is how essential the poem was to the ritual. It wasn't an accessory. It was the soul of the act. Without the poem, the death lacked clarity. Without words, your final breath could be misunderstood. Imagine it. Your final words are spoken softly. Everyone present hears them. You are not begging for forgiveness. You are offering closure. Some scholars believe this aspect of seppuku poetry was the part samurai feared most. Not the blade, but the silence that might come in place of the right verse. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. In some elite samurai families, jizei were written weeks ahead of plants, with multiple drafts exchanged and discussed like works of art. Imagine giving notes on someone's death poem over tea. Maybe swap that image of the crane. It's been done. How about a pine tree? It sounds absurd, but to the samurai, it was deadly serious. The final poem reflected your inner world more than any sword ever could, and for those witnessing your death lord's comrades, scribes, it was a kind of emotional map, a guide to how you entered the void. Take the story of Asano Naganori, the daimyo whose forced seppuku sparked the legend of the 47 Ronin. Before plunging the blade into his stomach, he composed this, more than the cherry blossoms, inviting a wind to blow them away. I am wondering what to do with the remaining springtime. It's quiet, melancholy, measured, and profoundly Japanese, loaded with seasonal metaphor and the ache of fleeting beauty. Historians still argue whether some of the more elegant poems attributed to famous warriors were actually penned by them, or later stylized by chroniclers to make the story cleaner. The character, but regardless of authorship, the ideal remains grace under the most impossible pressure. And if you think there was only one way to write these poems, think again. Some were serene, some scathing, some were full of rage. Take Seigo Takamori, the so-called last true samurai who led a doomed rebellion in 1877. In one version of the tale, he died with dignity and poetry. In others, he refused to write one at all. His silence, a protest against a new imperial regime. Sometimes, not writing a death poem said just as much. We'll explore that more in a later section. But for now, you sit in that chamber, the blade lies waiting. You feel every heartbeat. You read over your own final verse. Once more, the ink fades, as breath does neither can be held. Let the blade speak next. You nod, and in that moment, you are more yourself than you have ever been. Now, here's something few outside Japan know. Death poems were often collected and passed down. Some were preserved in family shrines, others made it into anthologies, temple archives, even children's textbooks centuries later. Why? Because even in a society so immersed in martial tradition, the act of dying well and expressing it well was seen as an art form. If your blade was your reputation, your poem was your essence. One final whisper to the world. This was me. There's a candle beside you now. The monk murmurs a sutra. Your second kneels quietly behind you, hand poised. And as the blade lifts from the floor, you are not afraid. You've already said goodbye, and your final words, inked just hours before, will outlive you. They'll be recited in the hallway, copied by students, whispered over tea 100 years from now. Not bad. For a few lines written before breakfast, evening settles like silk over the compound. Lanterns flicker behind paper screens, casting gentle shadows that stretch and lean with every gust of wind. The training yard is quiet now, but you can still smell the earther, sweat-soaked straw mats, the worn lacquer of 1,000 sword hilts, and somewhere nearby someone is writing. Not a treatise, not a letter, a poem, another because death, like nightfall, returns on a rhythm, and poetry is how you learn to ride. It's tied instead of being swallowed by it. But what if you didn't have time to prepare? What if your death came not by ritual, but by ambush? Not in the presence of ceremony, but in the chaos of betrayal, fire, or flight. What becomes of the death poem then? This section is about unfinished verses, the fragments, the final syllables left dangling, the poetry that never quite made it to the paper. Mainstream historical fact. Not all samurai died with the luxury of time. In fact, most deaths in battle or political intrigue came quickly: arrows, blades, poisoned tea, or surprise raids. In those moments, the jizei was often imagined, retold, or constructed posthumously. Entire traditions emerged of writing the poem on behalf of the dead. Scribes or surviving comrades would craft verses that felt appropriates something the fallen warrior might have said, had they the breath. It wasn't deception, it was honor, a poetic bandage applied to a wound that fate tore open too fast. Historians still argue whether these ghost-written jizei should be considered authentic. Historical records, or cultural artifacts of communal mourning. Some believe they reflect more about the society's values than the individual's last thoughts. But either way, they became part of the legacy. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. In some noble houses, if a samurai died without a recorded death poem, a family member or monk would meditate for days and then compose one while channeling the spirit of the departed, often during elaborate tea rituals. Think, but with brush and ink. These poems were then framed and placed in the family shrine, right alongside actual portraits and armor, a final word conjured from silence. Now imagine you in that situation. You've fallen in battle, too fast to reach your brush. No time for ink, no time for verse. Your comrades gather, bruised and bloodied, and someone begins to write. He closes his eyes, breathes in the smell of your sweat and steel, and pens this. A blade swung too early, the moon still rising. Brother, I followed it. He signs your name beneath it. Hands trembling, not because he lied but because he loved you, and for the world, that poem becomes yours. That's the strange thing about these verses. They don't always belong to the person who died. They sometimes belong to the people left behind. This practice wasn't limited to warriors either. Courtiers, monks, and even geisha left behind stylized poems, some written hours before death, others years prior. But when death came without warning, families still found ways to speak on their behalf. The line between personal voice and collective memory blurred. Intentionally, even today, if you walk into certain shrines or small museums in Kyoto or Kamakura, you might see a calligraphed panel mounted above an ancestral altar. No name, just a 4-line poem and a single date. A whisper from someone who never got the chance to speak aloud. And then there are the truly haunting cases, like the warrior poet Sukahara Bakudan's student, who was struck by a stray arrow during a border skirmish before he ever entered a duel. He was young at an and had written dozens of practice Gise in anticipation of his future glory. His master found one among his belongings. Not dated, just tucked between pages of a sword manual, it read,